good evening and welcome everybody to this, which is the New South Wales History Council's History Effect, a series we have produced for you and we're really pleased to be able to share online. I am Associate Professor Nancy Cushing from the University of Newcastle and Vice President of the History Council, and I'm hosting this week's sessions on the 1918-19 pneumonic influenza pandemic, or Spanish flu. Peter Hobbins started the series beautifully, I thought, last night, and tonight I'm very pleased to welcome Dr. Lisa Murray to speak on the 1919 flu, fossicking in the Sydney City Council archives. Before we start, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which the History Council offices sit in Sydney, the Gadigal clan of the Eora people and their elders past, present and future, and also the Awabakal people who are the traditional owners of the land on which I am sitting tonight. So just a bit of housekeeping. So we've muted everybody on the way in, so that's just so that we don't have any accidental background noise. If you would like to communicate with us, please use the chat function. And if there's a question that occurs to you as Lisa is speaking, we'd love you to put it in the chat and then I'll convey those questions to her in the final 10 minutes of the presentation. So Lisa is no doubt well known to many of you, and you, I think, last night might have had a look at Australian Story because over 1 million Australians did, and they would have seen Lisa there with Peter and with our speaker for tomorrow night, Leila Elmuth. It was a fabulous production, and I think it's a resource that we'll be using for a long time. Lisa is one of Australia's leading public historians, having been the Sydney City Historian for the past 10 years and currently chair of the Professional Historians Association. Her abiding research interest is in cemeteries, a topic not completely unconnected with pandemics, and she has recently published a field guide to Sydney's cemeteries. Tonight, Lisa is going to introduce us to the rich archives of the Sydney City Council and use them to show how the council helped to fight the Spanish flu. So a very warm welcome, Lisa.
Thanks very much, Nancy. And hello to everyone who's joined us this evening. Thank you for the acknowledgement of country. I would like to also acknowledge that I live and work on the land of the Wongal people here in Sydney, part of the Eora Nation. I'm going to start by sharing my screen with you all and we'll go from there. So the centenary of the influenza outbreak presented for me a really unique opportunity to fossick in the archives. I jumped at the opportunity to find out what might be held in the archives, and because they're things that I use every day in my position as a city historian. So it's always great to have another topic to explore. And a historical health event like this, where responsibilities move across government jurisdictions, is really a challenging thing to research, and I was curious to discover what records might survive in the city archives and how they might reflect on the City Council's response to the flu. Now, the City Archives holds records that are created by Sydney Municipal Council and its subsequent corporate entities, and the records date from 1842 right through to the present day. And the archive is available to be accessed by the general public as well as staff and researchers. Now, one of the key tricks about researching a government archive is to move beyond the keyword search, move beyond Dr. Google. It's important to think about the functions and the activities of council. So what were the councillor and staff roles and responsibilities? What did they do? What departments might have existed to oversee these activities, and thus what type of records might have been created to record these activities? This sort of question helps set your expectations for the types of historical records that you might find, and also helps you look for information within broader reports generated by the council. So when thinking about what the city archives might hold, I did have a few leads in terms of the pneumonic influenza of 1919. I knew, for example, that Sydney Municipal Council in 1919 had a city health officer, and his name was Dr. James Purdy. And I just want to show you a photo of him now. He was the city health officer from 1913 to 1936, and he had a dual role. Under the Public Health Act, the city and the metropolitan suburbs were designated as one health district. So Dr. Purdy was both the city health officer, but also the district medical officer. At the City of Sydney Council, he oversaw the city health and sanitation department. So in terms of records, there could be correspondence from the City Health Officer, as well as reports presented to the Health and Recreations Committee. Pneumonic influenza was declared a notifiable disease under the Public Health Act, and all municipal councils had to keep an infectious diseases register. So cases of pneumonic influenza would have been listed in that. So that was another key record that I really wanted to check out. I also knew that the pneumonic influenza epidemic fell within the reign of Thomas Nesbitt, the town clerk, and he wrote comprehensive annual reports on all of the major decisions, public works, and events that happened at the time. So I was pretty confident that the annual reports of council in 1919 would be a really good starting point to get an overview of council's response to the influenza outbreak. The town clerk was a great administrator, and he kept tabs on all the correspondence coming in and out of the council. So there was the town clerk's department correspondence folders that I needed to have a look at, and also the town clerk's news clippings books, both of which have been comprehensively listed and catalogued by our volunteers in the archives catalogue. So I was pretty confident I could find a lot of material there as well. Well, what did I find? What was Sydney City Council's response to the epidemic? Imperial and global communications via the Telegraph and subsequently newspapers ensured that everyone knew that the disease was on its way to Sydney. On the 10th of November 1918, the Lord Mayor, under delegation of council, approved the free distribution of disinfectant, and this was to be done without discrimination to all ratepayers. This was the council preparing. And the decision was reportedly taken in consideration of, quote, the very possibility of an outbreak of influenza and the necessity for efficient disinfection of households. The Lord Mayor, who was James Joynton Smith, and the City Health Officer, Dr. Purdy, were also involved in a range of meetings with state government from late 1918. And the town clerk was also in regular communication with the Department of Public Health. There was a lot of publicity and discussion of the impending health crisis in the newspapers, especially through January and February of 1919. The town clerk's news clipping books document on a day-by-day basis the newspaper coverage, while the National Library of Australia's digitised newspapers allow us to get an overview and to search widely across newspapers. A news clipping volume such as the one shown here allows us to actually get a day-to-day understanding of what was being reported, and allows us to get into the mindset of the people. What were people reading about? What was the confusion and the conflicting advice that people were receiving? We can see this coming out in the newspaper clippings and cutting books. And this relentless coverage would have heightened the public's anxiety. Of course, their anxiety wasn't helped by the fact that the state government, as itself vacillated in its preventative measures and regulations, causing ongoing confusion about what quarantine rules should be followed by the general public. Several City Council aldermen were really frustrated by this response of the federal government and, in fact, the state government, who they blamed for allowing the spread of influenza to New South Wales. In February 1919, the council actually debated a protest motion which railed against the ineptitude of the federal authorities and also complained about the inane and drastic restrictions imposed indiscriminately upon the people of New South Wales government by the New South Wales government, thereby causing unemployment, which renders the people insufficiently nourished against the spread of the disease. The motion was lost, but the heated debate demonstrates that the frustration felt by City Council aldermen in their inability to really curb the spread of the disease or provide a surefire cure, along with their anxiety about how government restrictions on movement and businesses would affect their economy and their local community. The proclamation by the state government in February 1919, closing various businesses and places of amusement, was inconvenient and caused much consternation. The Archbishop of Sydney reported to the Lord Mayor that the Sydney Anglican Diocese was, quote, prepared and eager to assist in every way called for by this grave visitation of divine providence. They closed their schools and offered them up for civic uses during the pandemic. Closer to home at council, the city librarian had to comply with all of the Department of Public Health's advice. And that varied from time to time. At different times, the library's reading rooms had to be closed and then later reopen. And when they did reopen, patrons were required to wear masks and to stand a certain distance apart at the counter. Now, Town Clerk Nesbitt viewed the compulsory closing of businesses by the state government as high-handed, illegal action and warned councillors to be very careful of their legal obligations. The council was approached by several lessees and tenants for rental relief, but the council was wary of the state government's promises for compensation. The town clerk had seen it all before. Promises by the state government for financial relief that never came through. He advised the council not to proceed with any rent relief for the affected businesses until the state government legislation had been passed. And so we still have in our archives a few correspondence files that relate to rent relief. The Municipal Employees Union was very concerned about the health of staff. A delegation visited the Lord Mayor to request that masks be purchased for staff. Similarly, the Federated Electrical Trades Union of Australia met with the Lord Mayor to represent staff, expressing their fear of infection as they dealt with the public on a daily basis and were questioning that an inhalation chamber be built. As a result of these representations, the council brought 2,500 masks that were issued to all staff. As several members of the electrical department contracted influenza, the first inhalation chamber was built in the courtyard next to the electric light building at Town Hall. Subsequently, there were 3 other inhalation chambers, one at Town Hall itself, one at the Central Powerhouse at Ultimo, and at the Municipal Garage and Workshop in Palmer Street. Now, these inhalation chambers didn't last long. Due to medical advice, they were actually discontinued by the 16th of April. Despite the precautions, at least 3 staff from the electric lighting department were diagnosed with pneumonic influenza, and 1 subsequently died. The council passed several resolutions to ensure staff suffering from influenza received pay. Originally, proportional sick pay was passed, and then they decided in July 1919, as the epidemic continued, that staff would get full pay allowances for the whole time that they were absent from duty as a consequence of influenza. And this was retrospectively applied from January of 1919. Council property and staff were also offered up to help fight the pandemic. The council provided the use of the Lower Town Hall as an inoculation depot for staff and the general public. It was in use every afternoon, Monday to Friday, from the 29th of January. The council was particularly concerned about their sanitary inspectors. They were essential workers and continued their jobs doing house-to-house inspections. They were at the frontier of fighting against influenza, and so the council took out life insurance for the city health officer and 6 sanitary inspectors. There were 13 depots established by the state government with the help of the city health officer across the city area, 1 in each of the city council wards. 6 officers from the City Health and Sanitation Department were among the nurses and medical officers detailed for special duty at the depots. They were required to investigate every reported case or suspected case of influenza, inspecting the house and identifying contacts. In recognition of their dedication and working overtime, Council granted each of the sanitary officers a £10 bonus, which was quite a lot of money. The Lord Mayor of Sydney, of course, was a political figurehead. And so even though the public health response was being coordinated by the state government, the City Council received many pieces of advice and correspondence from the public, sharing formulas for cures, touting for business in the supply of disinfectants and other medical miracles, and offering their assistance in this health crisis in 1919. Cures were sent from mad citizens in New Zealand who claimed to have cured themselves and their cat from influenza. We had another visitor, Hughie Ogilvie, a versatile Scotch comedian, who shared a remedy from a doctor in Chicago. The Lord Mayor of the day, Richard Watkins Richards, published this in the local papers in April 19 to share a simple remedy that people could make at home, and that's illustrated there on the left. Harris Orchard Sprays and Disinfectants wrote to the City Council in February 1919, touting their products, particularly the disinfectant Microl, and soliciting a trial order. Although disinfectant had previously been distributed by the council, by February 1919, the City Health Officer, Dr. Purdy, was advising the town clerk against its use, so an order was not placed. Another company had more success. A flyer promoting Cylin was sent to the council, and it appears from the associated marginalia in the file that the council placed an order. This poster is fascinating in its broad advice to the public, telling everyone about prevention is better than cure and how to prevent infection spreading. Do it now. So how was the City of Sydney affected by the epidemic? Unfortunately, the infectious diseases registers for the City of Sydney local government area do not appear to have survived. They're not in our archive. Infectious diseases records do survive from 2 municipalities that were later amalgamated with the city, Paddington Municipality and Erskineville Municipality. These registers note the date of the report of the infectious disease, the medical officer, the patient name, gender, age, address, municipal ward, and the address at the time of the attack. However, these registers do have their limitations. Not all cases were recorded in them. In Erskineville, for example, 47 cases were registered in the official register, but the official figures for the cases reported later were 87 cases. So that's quite a discrepancy. And it probably reflects the sort of difficulties of maintaining records during a time of pandemic and health crisis. Nevertheless, the registers do allow local historians to track individual cases in the municipality and provide an intimate view of the pandemic. However, for the City Council, we need to look elsewhere. The City Health Officer's monthly reports to the Health and Recreations Committee in 1919 did provide statistics for notifiable diseases. And so I could collate the number of cases and the number of deaths for the City of Sydney. We can see here on the graph that there are 1,902 cases reported in 1919, and there were 679 deaths. And we can see there are also peaks, two peaks really, one in April and another in June. A breakdown of the cases by wards was also published in the annual report. And so that allows you to see the spread of the disease across areas. Now, this might not mean a lot, but when we actually map it across a map, we can see the distribution of the disease. Were there any sort of hotspots? When we put it on this map, we can see it was pretty evenly spread. The sort of one outlier is really down around Woolloomooloo or Burke Ward, which only had 68 cases recorded. I'm sure you can recognise many of the responses from 1919 that are similar to today. For me, the most fascinating thing was the broad discussion in the newspapers and the amount of correspondence and advice shared through 1919. And of course, the importance of leadership during a pandemic or civic crisis. Without leadership, fear and anxiety spreads. Many of the treatments to stop the spread remain the same today. And as the public health advice from the agents of Cylin are just as relevant. As the poster exhorted, every citizen should understand his duty to the community by adopting such safeguards as will tend to prevent the spread of epidemic disease. Prevention is better than cure. Keep cool, keep cheerful, do not worry. Maintain the fight against germs and carry on. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lisa. Those were stirring words to finish, and just so much interesting material there. Just the beauty of the records themselves is really striking. I can see some applause being directed in your way. So yeah, as the messages say there, we've got about 10 minutes for questions. So if you would like to send any through, please let us know. But I will get stuck in straight away. And you finished on the disinfectant, and I was struck that you said that from the 10th of December it was made freely available to people in the council area. Do you think that in taking those sorts of measures that they were just repeating what had been done for the plague, 15, 16 years earlier, or were those really measures that would have some efficacy against influenza?
Because it was circulated in December, and the decision was made by the Lord Mayor, and it was a time when there was, I think, a slight recess in the council, and so they delegated some extra powers to the Lord Mayor to make decisions on this. I think that it was partly a sort of just a broad public health response that was influenced by earlier things like the plague, which was experienced over multiple, right across, I guess, the first and second decades of the 20th century. So I think that's part of it. And the fact that within a few months, the city health officer is actually advising, no, we're not going to buy more disinfectant. That's not the way to do it. I think shows the sort of shift from preparing everyone to actually trying to respond effectively with the best medical advice. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. Looking for questions. I don't see any yet. Don't be shy. If you have something, please let us know. And I have another question, so I'll follow on. I thought it was really interesting that both Peter last night and you tonight, we're cautioning researchers against too much troviness, if that's now a verb. So I think for a lot of us, as soon as we are onto a new topic, into Trove, it's so exciting. You can find newspaper articles that are written about that topic. But it does have limitations, and sometimes using more local and different types of records can be really shed new light beyond what was being said in newspapers. And so I wondered if you would like to talk about that in terms of council records. And I guess particularly you mentioned the term marginalia, and I don't know if everyone knows what that means, and what extra information can you find in marginalia?
Sure. So I think it's important to say that Trove and the digitised newspapers are an amazing resource, and I use them all the time. And if Trove for some reason goes down, I have withdrawal symptoms. So it's part of the armory of historians and researchers today. It's definitely something that we use every day, but I really like to use it alongside other resources. I think one of the things is that, of course, the way Trove works is it does work often best on a keyword search and things. And so I think people find it sometimes a little bit confronting to enter an archive or consider trying to do research in a different body of records and trying to get their heads around how best to do that. And so that's why I think, thinking about what was the purpose of this archive, what might I expect there, is really important to help you shape what you might then find. There's no point, for instance, looking in the city archive for necessarily personal diaries, for instance, because that is not something that the city council produced, and it's not something that they collect. If we're looking for personal diaries, we're going to go to the state library, we're going to go maybe to local historical societies to see what they might have, and so on. So it's about thinking about your records, and the way that our records are kept. Things like finding that poster of promoting Cylin that is really quite exciting to find something like that, because it was attached to a very short letter, and it was just in this one folder. And so when when I looked at it, it was sort of, I realised that the size of the poster was quite big, and the way it sort of said to the public, it was clearly something that was meant to be put up maybe on telegraph poles, in the windows of chemists, and so on. So it wasn't something that would necessarily survive. So it was very exciting to find it in the archive. What I meant by marginalia when I was talking about, what happened, how do I know anything about this? It had a short letter attached to it, and it was really just the town clerk saying to the city health officer, we've received this, what do you think, essentially. And the city health officer, rather than sort of typing up a reply and everything, because the way the business process was that the town clerk could get it, he'd go, harumph, all right, let's see what the city health officer thinks, sends it, attaches it, and then sort of puts it in the internal mail, gets onto the desk of the city health officer, and he looks at it and goes, no, we're not doing disinfectant down. And he just writes in the margin. It's kind of like the post-it notes of the early 20th century, just to sort of write in there. So, and this could happen on, like, in the margin of the document, or on the back. They'd often fold up the corner and then scroll it along the back. So it's really important when you're looking at archival material from a business archive to sort of not only check the front, but also check the back of records to kind of see what little annotations might be there that might give you a clue of what happened next, what was actioned from this flyer.
Yeah, and I think that is just so exciting, all that really fine-grained stuff that is just not going to be picked up in newspapers and in the digitized sources that we have.
That's right.
Now the questions are rolling in, so let's see if we can get through a few of them. So one asks about your interest in cemeteries and whether there was any impact on cemeteries from the Spanish flu, particularly whether you have come across any memorials to the flu or its victims.
Well, that's a great question, and there are a couple of cemeteries here in Sydney that are particularly connected to the influenza of 1918-19, and they're associated with infectious diseases. So the quarantine station up at North Head, the third cemetery that still survives there in the national park, has a number of memorials. So the very first people that were quarantined, particularly soldiers coming back from World War One, their ships were quarantined at North Head and at the quarantine station there. So there are a number of memorials there, and that's a really amazing site to go visit, and it's open to the public. You can go visit that. There's also a cemetery down at associated with the Coast Hospital, which was also an infectious diseases hospital, and the cemetery there also has some monuments there. As for elsewhere around the metropolitan area, people rarely put what people died of unless it was sort of accidental death. Then it's often reflected on a memorial inscription. But people didn't generally advertise that their loved one died of an infectious disease. So it tends not to be noticeable so much unless you're attuned to, if you know that there was sort of a real spike in deaths in an area, then you'll see it in probably the number of graves around a particular time. But because Metropolitan Sydney had a large number of cemeteries in 1919 that were active, it's quite difficult to see. It's much easier to see that sort of the influence and impact of an epidemic in cemeteries in regional towns where the sort of the fluctuations in deaths might be a bit more obvious.
Okay. Now we've got several more questions, but I think we better just have one more. Socioeconomic groups, Indigenous groups, were they affected differently, and do you see that sort of coming through in any of the council records? Can you differentiate between, I mean, it was interesting you pointed to Woolloomooloo, I think, not having so many cases, which was quite a working class area at the time. So did any of that come through?
Look, I did not see that coming through at all. I think the City Council was very concerned. In the early 20th century, a lot of their area was working class areas, and because I guess there was a lot of movement of people through the city working and so on, and of course with the wharves and everything, a lot of people in close proximity and then moving out to the suburbs, so that the city could have been a really big place of a real spike. In terms of the sort of detail, the records we have for the City of Sydney local government area don't reveal anything around Indigenous people. We do know that Indigenous people were living in Redfern in the early 20th century and around in Glebe, and so they would have been, like everyone else, sort of open and vulnerable to the disease, but I don't have any specifics.
Civic leader had died. So do you know anything more about you mentioned one, were there other council workers who died?
We don't have a lot of records around that, and I do know the name of the person who died. He was a shift electrician, so would work day shifts and night shifts and so on. His name was Mullins. So we have a little bit about that. And I think if we delved in more to some of the sick pay and things, we might find out a little bit more. But there was pretty small casualties amongst the city staff, which is pretty amazing. Like, there were certainly cases, but in terms of actual deaths, they were quite low, which is pretty...
That is interesting.
Yeah.
And sorry, this is not really a follow-on, but in the chart of the deaths that you showed, I didn't see that there was that bigger, where there was the two peaks. And is that right, that it wasn't as pronounced in the Sydney Council area?
No, the big peak in the city area was April.
First one. Yeah, that's
then
what I thought.
It went down dramatically in May, went back up in June, and went back to the May level in July. So there is certainly a second smaller peak, but not in the same way if you look at it across Australia or across New South Wales or even across metropolitan Sydney. Yeah, there's more of a...
Interesting. And there was a higher rate of inoculation in Sydney than anywhere else. They say 40%. So it's interesting because, it wasn't immunization against the flu. It was only a counter-bacterial injection. So.
Yeah, and it's really hard to kind of collate a lot of that against records. I mean, not that the City Council had records relating to the actual inoculation. For those sorts of things, you probably have to look through the state archive to see those sorts of records. But it is certainly what I found really interesting in looking at the records, like the infectious diseases records, was just that what started out as a very methodical thing following administrative requirements and whatever soon obviously fell apart as cases increased, and people were reporting to different depots and hospitals and so on. And so the registers, to actually give the overview of infectious diseases, to actually get a sense of, are there clusters or whatever, you just can't use them in that way. And I think, and the same thing happened with inoculation, that originally there were going to be 2 inoculations,
yes,
but they decided then they didn't have enough, and so they only got 1. And then the recording of who got vaccinated kind of fell apart, and that sort of breaking down of systems as everyone's sort of running as quickly as they can to deal with the crisis, record keeping often falls by the wayside, which is really frustrating for historians. Because when we
but very predictable.
Yeah.
But okay, and there were 2 other questions, but I think they're going to be both ones that you would just say this is not the sort of thing you'd find in the council archives. Were there records about how people were treated with the flu in hospital, or were most people treated at home? And are there diaries from nurses available?
So diaries from nurses is not something that we would have in the city archive. I would be starting to look myself at the state, in the state library, and also, perhaps scouring local historical societies for that sort of personal journal. I think the thing about personal journals of nurses or of anyone, there's probably going to be snippets. I had someone share with me the other day that they were reading Miles Franklin's diaries, and she was remembering some of the ships coming in for the quarantine station. I can't remember now if that was for the plague or if that was for 1919. Anyway. But yeah, so people might remember snippets, but it'll only be a very small proportion in what might be a very big diary. So it's a bit of a fishing expedition to kind of do that sort of looking at personal diaries. And What was the other question?
The other question was about hospitals, and I guess it was really wanting to know whether there were records of the hospitals and how they functioned at this time, or was it really the case that most people were treated at home and so there wouldn't be that much information around hospitals?
Hospitals is a bit tricky. It's not something we have information about. Because they set up so many depots in the City of Sydney area, my reaction from using those archives would be to say that a lot of people were treated at home, and it was the depots that were monitoring people. And certainly that's the story as it was presented in the Australian Story episode on Monday night. But before I would jump to that conclusion, I would probably, if I was researching it myself, I would be wanting to also, to investigate how many were treated at Sydney Hospital. And for that, that's the state government. So I'd be going to the state archives to look at those sorts of records.
All right, well, I think we'd better wrap up. We said we'd keep these sessions short and sweet, so about half an hour, so I think we've reached our time. But thank you so much, Lisa. And there really is just such a wealth of information there in the City Archives, and I hope that people do come around and visit you and have a look and see what they can find. So tomorrow, don't forget, we have one of Lisa's colleagues, Leila Elmas, coming, and she's going to talk about oral histories of the Spanish flu. So that'll be another fantastic session. And Lisa, I guess what I really enjoyed that you were drawing out was so many resonances with the present. And I mean, I'm sure that you were doing that deliberately, but the vacillation on policy, you know, this is okay one day and then something the next day, the concerns over unemployment, and the disagreement between levels of government are all things that I guess are very familiar to us. So thank you so much for sharing it all. And thank you to our audience, and I hope to see you again tomorrow night.